Welcome to Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into tree and plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff. Today, we're going to be talking about traits that are really important in STEM careers. And joining us is Marvin Lo, a research assistant at the Morton Arboretum, and we are going to be discussing versatility.
Thanks, Jessica. Happy to be here.
So, Marvin, we have a few things that we want our listeners to be able to get to know you a little bit before we talk about your career. And I know the common thread is you, but can you tell us a little bit more about home aquariums, tree roots, and NASA, and how they connect to Marvin Lo?
When I was growing up, I was really infatuated with aquariums and the plant life that went in them. And then from that spawned like a love for plants in general. And because of that, I started volunteering at the Arboretum, working with tree roots. And with that role, it got me involved in larger projects such as the NASA project. So that kind of is how everything comes together.
Can you talk a little bit more about the NASA project?
Yeah, so the NASA project is one where we had collaborators from NASA scientists who worked on the Challenger.
That's cool.
And yeah, we did a lot of space testing, I would say. So yeah.
On trees.
Yes, on trees, not in space.
So it sounds like you've got a really diverse background, but this common thread of loving plants throughout your experience with your hobbies, with your background. So there's some versatility in that. But my question for you is, what is your favorite part of working at the Morton Arboretum?
So my favorite part is definitely being outside, just because I really enjoy Mother Nature and seeing all the trees and wildlife and plants growing. And when springtime comes, it's really amazing just to watch everything just emerge out of this doom and gloom of winter. So that's probably one of my favorite parts.
I think Jessica and I would have to agree with you on that.
It's true.
Especially this time of the year. But that being said, we're excited to talk with you about your current role and how versatility kind of plays a part in that. But we'll kind of start with also your path leading into your current role. So with that, we'll get started.
Marvin, can you just talk a little bit more about what your job is like as a research assistant?
Okay, so like a typical day for me, depending on the season, it varies a lot, actually. So, like during the springtime, when trees are starting to grow, or summertime when they're leafing out, we really have to get out in the field and get field work done. Whether that's either like planting trees or taking care of them or installing sensors, it's a very time-sensitive thing because we have such a short season for putting things out.
Can you talk more about the sensors?
Yeah, so we use a lot of technology in our job. Right now, we're starting to incorporate a lot of these like dendrobands, which are like pieces of technology that measure the diameter growth of the trees. We've got sap flow meters that we're installing, which kind of watch the water usage of plants. We also have some soil temperature sensors. So a bunch of things like that where we're using technology in ways in which we can monitor trees.
And so is that technology essentially looking for patterns in when there's a tree or plant event?
Yeah, so we're kind of monitoring the trees and how they're reacting to the environment. So this is one way we can really learn about trees and what they're doing and how they, respond to environmental conditions of what's going on. So like when springtime comes around and it starts warming up, what are the trees doing? Are they growing their roots? Are they, expanding in the wood? Are they water up? So, yeah.
Awesome. Sounds like a lot of fun.
Versatility in the tree as well.
Yeah. I know you mentioned you started volunteering and working with tree roots. Have you always had an interest in plant science, or what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
So I've always had an interest in plants when I was young. I kept orchids when I was like a teenager. I went to nurseries all the time with my parents, and I would just like garden. But I didn't really think of it as a career. And then at one point, I wanted to go to school to be a veterinary doctor. And then at some point, I decided I couldn't do that. It was too tough working on animals. And plants aren't nearly as sensitive, I would say. So
Okay.
I kind of made that transition into the plant world, the biology world.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that, I think a lot of people don't realize that they can work with plants as a career. And I know that was something that I think I faced that most of our guests from season 1, that's a common thread. People like to be outside, and they don't realize that this is an amazing option for employment someday. But can you talk a little bit? You said that you were going to be thinking about being a vet. Talk about your education and how that leads to the role that you have now?
Okay, so I originally went to school to study veterinary science. So I did a lot of animal physiology, animal courses. I never even actually took a plant course. So
Really?
That's a little surprising. Most people hear that and they're like, how do you work with plants if you've never done that? Yeah, so my background traditionally is with like animal stuff. But an opportunity opened up to volunteer at the Arboretum. And then, after I graduated from school, I was like, I got to go do something. And I started volunteering in my free time. And I saw that, there was a volunteering opportunity. So I was like, I'll go do it. And there happened to be an opening in the root lab. So I started out as a volunteer in the root lab, and I really, loved what I was doing. I was taking pictures of tree roots, and I was digging trees up and looking at the roots all the time. And it was an odd task, but it was also fun at the same time. So that's kind of the origins of how I started.
Awesome. I know you've gotten, and you spoke a little bit about this when we were kind of talking about some things that connect to you, that one of your projects, you got to use technology used with the Challenger, but on trees. And I know you've gotten to do a lot of really cool and interesting projects at the Arboretum. Can you talk about a favorite or one that is just kind of sticks out in your mind?
Yeah, so my favorite project probably was the NASA research project because it was one of the first larger projects I was exposed to. We had scientists come in from Europe, so collaborators, and also these NASA scientists who work on the Space Shuttle Challenger. So because it was so many people together, it was a large endeavor. We wanted to figure out, we were trying to track how these trees were behaving when they were being blown over. And with the technology that NASA has, we're able to track the stresses and strains applied to trees.
Okay.
And it was a large project because we had to find some trees that were, we were able to destructively harvest. And at that point, EAB, which is Emerald Ash Borer, had started showing up in our area. So, we picked out a couple ashes, we stripped the bark off, painted some dots on these trees. They look like polka dot trees. And then we put these cameras on them just to track them as we pulled them over with a winch. But it was a great learning experience because I got to see, all aspects of research, and it's really what I enjoy.
And for our listeners, please take a look at our bonus content because I believe we have a video of this project. Now, Marvin, what are you working on right now in the lab? What's your exciting project?
So right now, currently, we are working in these plots that we call the forestry plots. These are plots that have been on the Arboretum grounds for 50, 60, 70 years. They were planted long ago by the Mortons. And the whole idea was they were trying to see what they could do with the land that the Morton Arboretum is on. So there's a bunch of different types of species, and we are basically going to monitor these trees in a relatively high level of detail. So we're going to put dendrobands on them, which are like bands that basically watch the diameter of the tree change as it grows. We're putting sap flow meters, which will monitor the water usage of the trees as they're growing or leafing out. We're installing soil sensors, which will look at the soil temperature and the soil moisture levels. We've installed mini rhizotron tubes in the ground, which are tubes that go down into the ground, and then we put a scanner down, and it takes an image of what is growing up against the tube. So as the roots are growing up against the tube, we can track them. And then we're also tracking phenology, which is kind of the leafing out of trees during the spring and the senescing of leaves in the fall when they start changing color.
And what's the benefit of looking at all of these different things all at the same time with the same groups of trees or different types of groupings of trees?
So over time, if we can watch these trees doing what they do in nature, we're going to try and figure out what they're doing and why they do it and when they do it. So these are like basic important facts that we need to learn about trees. We don't know why they leaf out at a certain time or why they drop their leaves at a certain time or when they start growing roots. Like, why do they do it? So all of this information will allow us to learn more about what they do. and why they do it.
Especially with a kind of a species-focused
Yes.
view, because with having the forestry plots with all the same species, that'll make it so it's easier for you to make those observations of what's going on.
Yes, they're long-term. They've been there a long time, so they've kind of been isolated, and they haven't been touched for, decades. And that's the whole idea, is because they're so untouched, they're a good source of information for us.
Very cool. I know you've talked a lot about your work in the Root Lab and also kind of part of this forestry plot project. And I know that roots are a really vulnerable part of trees. They're subject to compaction or, all the different conditions, even though they're relatively unseen. Can you explain how, and you've touched upon this a little bit already, but just maybe expand upon how the information that you're learning about them now as part of this forestry plot project can be used beyond the lab? So what, can it help urban trees, or what does it help us to use in everyday life?
So like you said, you mentioned urban trees. One aspect of this forestry plot project is, if we know how much moisture these trees can tolerate, for example, in an urban environment, it can be very moist in like a tree planting pit. So if we know that certain species, their roots do better in really moist environments, we can apply that to, selecting for urban trees that would tolerate, more moist areas, basically. So that's one aspect of how this might help.
Very cool.
So Marvin, you have a lot of irons in the fire, and you're working on a lot of different really cool research projects. I think it's time for us to talk about the trait versatility. So would you like to elaborate a little bit about, how versatility is a part of your work?
Yeah, so I have to be able to do many different things in the lab. Because I'm both inside and outside, I have to be able to, collect data inside, analyze data at the computer. I also have to be able to go outside and, dig up a tree, or know how to install a sensor, or, be able to ID trees sometimes. It's always a learning experience. There's always something I need to learn, and that's one great part about it.
I would imagine also because you're sometimes switching from project to project, or maybe have a couple things going on at one time. Can you talk a little bit about how you've either adapted to a new project when one ends, or how you kind of manage multiple things going on at one time when you need to switch gears, from one thing to the next?
Yeah, so adapting to different projects. The good thing about it is some projects use the same type of, information. I can apply information from one project to another, but there's always something new to learn. So like with an upcoming project, like this forestry plot, I never knew how to install sap flow sensors. But now I know how to install sap flow sensors. I know how to hook them up. I can wire up a solar charger. I can wire up a solar panel. And, this is something that I've just learned. So that's one great thing about, my job, is I have to be able to learn new things and be able to use them. So like in the past, we've had soil moisture sensors and soil temperature sensors. And now we're applying them to this new forestry plot. And we're using the same equipment. So it's, it's a great learning experience.
That's really cool. Speaking of different types of research experience, I think you should talk a little bit about sonic tomography, because that's one of my favorite projects that you work on.
Yeah, so sonic tomography is an interesting tool. If you listen to the name itself, sonic tomography, it means sonic mapping. So what we do is we take these sensors and we put them on nails that we've tapped into a tree, around the tree, and we send signals from one nail to the rest of the nails, and that gets sent to a computer. And when we finish that setup, this software builds a whole model in the computer, kind of showing, where there's pockets of decay in this tree. It's something where we don't have to destructively take down the tree to analyze what's going on. And then we can see in great detail what is happening in that tree. And then we can decide what we need to do.
And the nails don't hurt the tree.
No, the nails kind of get absorbed by the tree, I would say. They, over time, they will just eventually disappear.
It's kind of like getting an inside view of the tree trunk without having to do any, I guess, what we would think of as like dissection or anything like that. But you can see kind of what's happening on the inside. What a cool use of technology.
And it has to be really beneficial, too, in environments where you don't want to cut down the tree, but you want to check and make sure it's not going to fall and hurt anybody.
Yeah, like on a street, if you have a really nice old tree and you don't want to cut it down, sonic tomography is a great way to look at that tree and determine what's going on inside that tree without having to actually harm it.
Very cool.
Well, we're excited also to kind of have an understanding of how being versatile, when you look at or when you think about your whole career path, how it's kind of allowed you to adapt. Can you talk a little bit about how versatility has helped to grow your career over time?
So I would say being versatile has allowed me to take on many different roles. I've been in many different labs at the Morton Arboretum. So I've worked for people in the plant pathology lab. I've worked for soil sciences, the root lab, 2 different root labs, also the arboricultural research lab. And being versatile has allowed me to adapt to new conditions and learn new things so I could just apply my skills in different ways, I would say.
And speaking of applying your skills in different ways, I know that one of the first things that we talked about is your love of aquariums. But what our listeners may not know is that you are a world-ranking aquascaper. That is amazing, and I think you should talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of my passions is aquariums, and I've always kept fish, and eventually that came to include plants. And in the aquarium world, there's this term they called aquascaping. And how we define it is it's landscaping underwater in an aquarium. So what we do is we'll take some like wood or rocks and some plants that can grow in riparian areas, which means they grow typically in very moist, wet habitats, and they can grow underwater. So we'll combine all of these into one small tank, or a large tank sometimes, and basically it'll be a landscape underwater. And there are some very prestigious competitions I like to compete in, so hopefully one day I can do well in some of them.
Well, you're already a world ranking. I mean, you should...
I want to get higher.
What was your rank?
I was ranked 45th.
Out of
around approximately 2,000.
It's very impressive.
That's very impressive.
But I want to get like number 7 or better. So.
And how do you use research with this hobby?
So there's a lot involved in fertilizing, injecting carbon dioxide. These are very high-tech, high-energy tanks. And research has helped just because I can determine, I'll selectively go through and change something and, determine if the tank is doing better or worse. And then I can constantly, apply different techniques to the tank just to get them to growing their best, I would say.
And how do you select the plants that you're putting in your design, or are they hard to come by? Do you grow everything on your own, or?
So I purchased some stuff, but most of it comes in small quantities, and you do have to grow it out. So I would say I do grow a lot, but I also started tissue culturing recently, which is something else I've picked up at the Arboretum.
So cool. Talk about that.
So tissue culturing is basically growing plants in sterile conditions in a nutrient medium. Typically, it's like a gel. And you basically take a little tiny node from one plant, put it into this culture, and you start multiplying it rapidly. And it's just one of the skills I've picked up working at the Arboretum.
And what's the advantage of doing tissue culturing?
So tissue culturing is great because everything is sterile. There's no snails or algae in them. That's kind of the nemesis of the planted tank world. Nobody likes snails or algae. The other good thing is...
Don't look at my tanks at home.
The other good thing is you can ship these worldwide because they are in sterile conditions. There are no restrictions on where they go, typically.
Okay.
We can import them, too,
So, Marvin, we've got to hear a lot about the different projects that you've worked on at the Arboretum and also your hobby and kind of how some of the things that you're learning in the lab or you're learning in your role have, influenced other aspects of your life, but also how, switching gears and being versatile has helped grow your career and also tackle different projects at different times. But there's a people aspect to that, too. So you're working with a lot of different people. There's a lot of different people leading different projects, and I'm sure that can be, not necessarily challenging to manage, but also, your time, you're kind of in a lot of different directions. So can you talk a little bit about how, how working with a lot of different people, how you manage switching gears to get the work done?
Yeah, so the way I work specifically, I have a couple different supervisors, I guess we'll put it that way. But the way I work is I kind of keep in my mind what projects are important, what has to get done. Certain projects are very important timing-wise, so they have to get done, in the spring or the fall. So those are kind of priority. If it's the right time of year, I have to get those done. So if I have to get plants planted in the spring for one supervisor, I'll do that. But otherwise, I just keep a running list of what's kind of taking priority and how long it'll take, and I will tend to just do things on my own and follow my priorities. If something really comes up with the supervisors, I'll just let them know, like, so-and-so needs me, but you also need me. Maybe you guys should talk amongst yourselves and figure out who needs me more.
It sounds like you'd have to be, to be able to switch gears too, you'd have to be pretty organized in kind of what's priority number one, and then what just is kind of the running list of things that can get done when you have a moment.
Yeah, definitely. Because I do keep that running list in my brain all the time.
Right.
So when my volunteers are in, sometimes they ask me, like, how do you remember all this? I'm just like, I know what projects are going on. I remember what I did, last year or whatnot. So.
No, I think that's great. And so, you've talked about the NASA project, you've talked about sonic tomography, and now I think we should talk about the other project that I think's so cool and also very difficult with field work. But can you talk a little bit about ice loading?
Yeah. So ice loading is one project I love and loathe at this point because it's such a cool project, but it's also, I have to do it in the dead of winter when things are freezing.
Yeah, can we describe what ice loading is?
So ice loading is basically, there typically is a lot of storms down south, ice storms, in which trees get damaged to the point of breaking, limbs falling down, injuring people, falling on cars.
Right.
So the whole point of this project that we're trying to do with ice loading is we're loading branches with water to simulate an ice storm, and we're trying to break the branches on these trees. These are trees that are research trees, not just trees, sitting on somebody's lawn. But we have plots where we spray water, freezing water onto trees in the dead of winter and wait for them to break. And we'll measure all these different variables of like the angles of the branches and how thick the ice is and how much ice has accumulated.
And ultimately, again, this is to understand how trees break, when they break, so we can take better care of trees, so we can potentially, if we're pruning them the right way, giving them the right care and maintenance, they won't break, correct?
Yes, this is all for the good of the trees, although we must sacrifice a couple.
And the people.
Yes.
Trees and people.
Yes.
There is some interesting links to this project also that we'll include in the bonus content.
Bonus content.
And some great visuals and a short graphic booklet that also showcases some of the work on this project. Marvin, we had some teachers on site for a recent workshop, and we shared with them your profile, your background, knowing that we were going to be talking to you as part of this season of Planted. And so they have some other questions that we're going to include before we let you go. But can you tell us a little bit what your kind of typical day looks like, understanding that there is no typical day, that in the winter you could be creating an ice storm, and in the spring you could be monitoring different plant events. But on a daily basis, how do you split your time between the field and the lab? And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we'll take, for example, right now, it's springtime. In the spring, we're busy installing sensors. So my typical day would be just to come into work, we'll have everything ready to go out in the field, and we just spend the whole day out in the field working. It's just got to get done. There's no time for anything else. Field work takes priority right now, depending on the project, of course. But if field work takes priority, that's what takes priority. Otherwise, sometimes analysis needs to be done. So, in the winter, it tends to slow down, and in the fall, it also slows down a little. So I might be inside, collecting data, organizing data, and then analyzing that data at the computer. Also, we've got a lot of volunteers, and sometimes we have to manage that. So, yeah, it's a little bit of both.
And in such different situations, because, field work is outside, and that can be in the winter or in the spring or summer. But then you also have the lab analysis and, upkeeping data. Which do you find the most challenging?
Oh, okay. So that's a tough one. They're both challenging in different ways. So field work is just physically exhausting on the body. If you're out, for 8 hours, crouching and kneeling and getting up and pulling things and digging into like gravel-filled soil, it's rough on the body.
That's a lot.
So you get a really good night's sleep. But at the same time, lab work or analysis is it's tougher on the brain. So, when you're trying to figure out how to analyze some data or how to plan a project or whatever it is that you have to do inside, it's racking on the brain, I would say. So they are both challenging in their own ways.
I could understand that. A balance of both. They both have their perks, but then they also both present their own set of challenges. I know you've talked with us a little bit about your aquascaping and your world ranking.
World ranking.
But our teachers were also interested in your involvement with the Chicago Aquatic Plant Society. And do you have any memorable aquatic or aquascaping experiences that you can share?
Yeah, so I'm part of this group called Chicago Aquatic Plant Society, as you mentioned. We're a nonprofit that we've started up to promote the keeping of aquatic plants, essentially. And I would say our group is to help, expand the knowledge. Most people don't know you can grow plants underwater. And that's the whole purpose of this group. People love gardening. They just don't know you can garden underwater. But one of my most memorable experiences would be, I would say, doing live competition. My first live competition, which was in a convention center with a bunch of aquarium people. And you have a set limit of time. I think it was 3 days to set up an aquarium with plants and rocks and everything. And then judges would come by and judge your tank. I think there was about 25 competitors. It's just a really adrenaline-pumping event. You're trying to get things in, trying to get plants in place. Everyone else is doing the same thing. You're looking over the shoulder, like seeing how far has that guy gone? How much has she done? So it's like there's a little adrenaline rush, but it's a lot of fun just competing with people and being around people that also love the hobby.
It makes me kind of think of like those cooking shows that I love to watch. Like they've got the timer and you've got to get going and create a masterpiece, but with plants. So it's even better.
Yep, exactly.
So, you work with trees, you work with, especially with roots and everything like that. But then your passion outside of work is aquatic plants. So, Marvin, terrestrial or aquatic plants? Which one's best?
I'm going to have to lean towards aquatics.
Oh, your supervisors are listening to this.
They're so interesting. I mean, they can grow out of water and underwater. I mean, the best of both worlds.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing I have an idea then as to which family your answer to this next question is going to fall. But since we ask all of our planted guests, and I know this is a very hard question, but can you tell us what is your favorite plant?
Ooh, that's a tough one. So I won't pick a species, but I'll go with a genus, and that genus would be Bucophalendra. They're just super interesting. They're in the aroid family, and they can grow terrestrially or submersed, underwater, aquatics. And the great thing about them is they're just so colorful. They have leaves that are blue or purple or red, and they're just amazing plants in that, they're in trouble in their natural environments. They're plants of concern. A lot of logging is happening in their areas of Borneo. So I think it would be sad to lose such an amazing plant that has such diverse leaf characteristics and, is just so colorful.
Well, Marvin, just thank you so much for being here today. I think it's really cool thinking about versatility with your job, with all the research that you do, and it's kind of like the aquatic plants that you love to work with, outside of water, in water. There's just this theme of versatility in this episode, which I think is so great, because it is a really powerful trait that you can have that can lead to a really diverse and exciting career. So thank you so much for being here today, Marvin.
Thank you for having me.
This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share, and let us know what you think. This is Jessica Turner-Scuff
And Megan Wiesbrook.
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.